Hi, everyone. Amiya here from Resonance Astrology, and welcome to my podcast. I'm so excited having you here, and I am recording this on November 21st at around 6 p.m. here in Europe time. And this is part of the 12th house series, which I'm doing every month. And this month, we will take a look at the seventh house in astrology. And I'm joined this time around by Tiziana. She has already been here for the third house episode, and I'm super excited we can also do the seventh house together.
Hi everyone, Tiziana here from Liminal Spaces Astrology. I'm a practicing astrologer. I'm a student of astrology. I'm very lucky to live in the beautiful city of Cape Town, and I'm also a photographer and an artist. So as Amiya mentioned, this is the second episode I'm doing with her, so I'm super excited to be here and to talk about the seventh house. And there was a little bit of a longer intro in our first collab. So if you want to hear a bit more about my journey with astrology and the third house, please go have a listen.
Great. And before we dive in, I want to do a small preface, as I always do. I'm going to put in the timestamps below. So if you've already heard me talk about this, feel free to skip forward. But if it's your first time listening, maybe listen to this part before we get into it. So I wanted to add that we both use whole sign houses and focus more on an ancient Hellenistic approach. And if you want to hear me talk more about this specifically in depth and why I choose to follow that path and the difference between, Placidus and whole sign houses, I have a super long segment, an introduction on the first house episode about all of this. So if you want an even longer deep dive, check out that first episode because it forms the whole basis of the houses. And yeah, so when we use whole sign houses, what we mean by that is we place the whole sign into one house, as the name itself already suggests. So we put the whole 30 degrees of one sign into one house, and this forms a very clear distinction and makes many other things a lot easier. But again, if you want to have a more in-depth explanation, check out the episode on the first house, as this really forms the basis of all the other houses. I also want to mention that we both do not prescribe to the astrology ABC, which puts the first house in correlation with Aries and Mars, and then the second house with Taurus, Venus, and so on and so forth. So we really separate the houses, the signs, and the planets, and treat them as like separate entities. Okay, so now that we clear this up, let's dive into the seventh house. I think dive is very interesting, specifically when talking about the seventh house, because it is called the setting place and it means somewhat of something of like to plunge and sink or enter or dive in, because the planets are literally sinking and diving into the earth where the descendant line is hitting.
So the seventh house is angular, and as Amiya said, it's called the setting place. The word Deutus, which was used by the Greek astrologers, means setting place. It's also got no planetary joy like some of the other houses, and it is the second or main house in the third angular triad based around the seventh house. It also coincides with the region in the sky where the planets and stars sink under the horizon at the degree of the descendant and is opposite the first house and the ascendant. And the reason why it's called the setting place is, of course, that's where the sun sets, because the diurnal motion of the sun, it rises in the east and sets in the west.
Exactly. It's interesting because when transits are happening in our chart, we kind of go the opposite direction, and like we're talking about the seventh house now, and we're
Right,
kind of like
right.
entering the horizon line and where the planets are more visible. We've already undergone all the houses where the planets are not visible and already have set. So it's really the difference between like the motions that we're talking about here. But in the diurnal motion, it is exactly as Tiziana already said, where the sun is setting. And it's particularly interesting because it is like the descendant line that kind of breaks it apart, just like on the ascendant line, where it depends on where your ascendant and descendant lie. They're always exactly opposing each other. They have the
Right.
exact same degree. So if your ascendant is at, let's say, 15 degrees of
I
Taurus
see.
or Pisces or whatever, any other sign, then then the other house, it's always going to be the opposite house, and your descendant is always going to fall at the exact same. So in my example, at 15 degrees of Scorpio or 15 degrees of Virgo. So that's just important to mention. So if you want to know your descendant, it's always the opposite sign of your rising sign.
Right, exactly. And also, it's another interesting thing about the fact that the sun sets in the west and it being called the setting place is in Egyptian solar philosophy, the seventh house actually symbolizes the place where there is a loss of light. So that is why it then has this symbolic meaning of a place of endings, because that is exactly where the sun, quote unquote, dies at sunset.
Yeah, and it's also what is interesting is because in Hellenistic astrology, we have this concept of sect, right? And it kind of like determines if your sun is above or below the ascendant or descendant line, which sect light your chart follows, if it's a day or a night chart. And oftentimes, I mean, even in my personal example, my sun is just 1 degree above my ascendant. I was literally born at sunrise, so I was like not quite sure is this a day or a night chart. It's definitely a day chart.
Yeah.
So it can even also be tricky when it's on the descendant and you're like, oh, when the sun is setting, do I have a day or a night chart? But I think Chris Brennan mentioned in one of his podcast episodes that the important factor is if the sun is still visible. And I mean, both of these states, when the sun is rising and when the sun is setting, are very special moments because they happen so quickly, kind of. And it's like, oh,
Right.
when is the sun still up and when is it not visible anymore? But as long as you can still see it, I would totally vouch for you having a day chart. And
Yeah.
generally, the rule is like if the sun is above your descendant and your ascendant line, you have a day chart.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's also, it makes me think of something that he had actually said. I don't remember which episode it was, but I recall what you're talking about. And I mean, it's really also just paying attention to like, what does it look like outside? And if it's
Mhm.
light, then, it kind of already is a given that that is, you're going to have a day chart because you can actually see the light.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Yeah, a lot of astrological symbolism comes from the interplay of like light and darkness, and if you see
right.
the sun or if you see the moons, and
Yeah, like what's super cool also about the opposite end, which is, like from ascendant to descendant. So obviously sun rising in the east and setting in the west. Just like an interesting mythological connection with the seventh house is the fact that it connects with all aspects of death. And for example, Egyptian tombs and cemeteries and burial grounds like all face towards the west because that was a really important part of Egyptian solar philosophy. They really had a strong connection to the rising and the setting of the sun, and that tied in a lot to the way that they lived their lives and the way that they worshiped the sun and what it actually symbolized for them.
yeah, I think it's also interesting, like the Dices, right? The goddess of the hour of the sunset. It's kind of like a personification of the setting sun, also because that is also kind of where the name comes from that place. So
Right.
it kind of is really representing the end of the day and the transformation into darkness. And Isis was one of the attendants of the goddess Harmonia, and which means harmony, right? And was
Yeah.
responsible for the West Wind's Gate because these sunrise and sunset moments are in a way like a brief intersection every day of a harmonious state where the sun rises out of the earth and then it goes back into the earth.
Right, that balance of light and dark, which is really becoming like a visible thing to see and to witness. I mean,
Um,
following from that, I suppose we could just say something like the early house doctrine was talking about the movement of the stars and that they rise, they mate, and they set. So again, it alludes to this metaphor of this journey of birth at the ascendant on the eastern horizon, culminating and then setting at the western horizon and symbolically dying. The daily journey of the sun against the wheel of the houses depicted the chronological ages of life. And depending on the author, the seventh house can be associated with the period of adulthood or the last age of life before death, which was essentially old age. I think it alludes to like what you were saying earlier, how we were talking about the primary motion and the secondary motion. And
Mm.
by primary motion, the sun is setting at the western horizon, but by secondary motion, the sun is actually moving into the upper hemisphere of the chart. So it's seen above the horizon. And because of that, it then becomes associated with more solar and masculine qualities. It's more of an active house, and its quality is expressed more outwardly. So then it's like more about people, and it's more social and more to do with relationships.
To also kind of like go back to like the angularity of the seventh house itself. It's like one of the stakes or anchors of the chart. I mean, all of the angular houses are, which is the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th. And the seventh house is considered a favorable and good house and is an important backbone of the chart. Angles are seen as portals or openings between the earth and the cosmos. And these are the places in the circle of the whole where the greatest influx of energy comes into the terrestrial realm. So planets in the seventh house or any other angle therefore are considered empowered and loud. And yeah, it's also a place where planetary events and significations manifest. And Ptolemy remarked that planets are the strongest whenever they are passing by the angles. And I think that's very important to consider because oftentimes when we look at someone's birth chart and they have planets passing by through one of their angular houses, usually a lot of things happen, or it's often also because if I think of the seventh house in correlation with relationships, it's like one of the biggest topics people usually ask astrologers for. So the seventh house and all the other angles are always so loud. Like it's the most asked questions and the most important transits. So
Right, right.
yeah.
100%. Yeah, I mean, like, also if you have planets in the first house, and as you're saying, any angular house or the 10th house. So, like for example, I have planets in the first and the 10th. So when I have transits to the seventh, it's not just stuff happening in relationships, it's also triggering a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah,
Where in the first
absolutely.
house and the 10th house, so it's often stuff that's to do with my character or my identity, and or my career. And I've also got mutable signs on the angles. So there's always this change happening for me, this like dynamic change, which is quite interesting whenever I have transits to the seventh.
Yeah, let's also talk about the angular triad itself surrounding the seventh house. So the planets that are next to the seventh house. So in this case, it would be the sixth and the eighth house. And the eighth house in ancient astrology was seen as the beginning of death due to the diurnal motion of the sun. The eighth house is the entry into the underworld, known as the gates of Hades. And then the opposite house of the eighth house, the second house, would be the exit point, so to say, and coming out of the underworld and heading towards the rising above to the horizon, so to the ascendant.
Yeah,
And then inevitably, planets in the eighth house will reach the seventh house and come to their endings, so to say.
yeah, yeah. I love that visual of the gate of Hades, like the entrance into the underworld and then the exit of the underworld. I just think it's so beautiful. Um, and then just with regards to the sixth house, the seventh place is the resting place after the toil of the sixth house. So, like the end of a day of affairs and hard work, Manilius referred to it as the conclusion of toil. So in modern times, this is like coming home from a long day's work and cracking open a beer and putting up your feet and kind of really enjoying the leisure of the end of a hard day's work. So, because obviously the sixth house is associated with hard work and labor, conflict, toil, and struggle. So,
Yeah.
this house in that way, even though it is associated with death, it's also associated with resolution or, the sort of the ending of the toil, which is represented by the sixth house.
Yeah, especially also because the sixth house has fallen away from the seventh house, like it used to be. If we look at the motion, if the
Right.
ascendant would change, then the sixth house used to be the seventh house and it has fallen away and became the sixth house. So I think that brings a bit more flavor to why it's associated like that. And I think it's interesting because the seventh house is kind of squished with these harsh houses because
Yeah.
like the eighth and sixth house are not the easiest places, and it's just like squished inside those rather harsh houses.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they not seen by they have no aspectual line to the ascendant. So they are those houses that are considered to be bad in Hellenistic and traditional astrology.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit more about the whole idea of the setting place. Why is the seventh house the setting place? Because the idea is kind of bringing something to resolution. So, what does resolution look like? It's usually death and endings. Not always literal, but it can be. So literal death, or it can mean finishing things up, closing things up, something that gets resolved. So, for example, a south node eclipse in the seventh house can lead to an end of an important relationships like a marriage.
Yeah, and I actually, in preparing for this, like went back and looked at some transits, and I actually found that I had a couple of full moon and new moon eclipses in 2007 that were aspecting within 3 degrees of my descendant degree in the seventh, and obviously also opposing my ascendant degree. And that was actually like the beginning of the end of the relationship that I was in. So, that is as an example of something that's not necessarily literal death, but it is certainly the end of or the resolution of a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, the seven can also be related to lawsuits, which are kind of a resolution. And if you
Yeah.
then consider that there is a benefit to the other people's money in the eight, which is a result of a lawsuit. So you can kind of see the interconnection of the seventh and the eighth here again.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And also the worship of the gods. The seventh house is associated with the worship of the gods because it relates to the acknowledgement of that which is transcendent. Um, so, Manilius talks about when the sun sets and the light fades, while the darkness takes over, we are reminded of the transcendent and that which is essentially beyond the material world, beyond the material plane. So in a way, this is like kind of Saturnian, and it made me think of the Thema Mundi where Saturn opposes the Sun in the Thema Mundi. So there is this kind of inherent Saturnian relationship between the sun setting and whatever is transcendent or even kind of godly in a way.
Yeah, and also like the seventh house in, the fact that it rules our social relationships. And Tiziana used the funny word. She also says social intercourse. I love that. I love that word. So it's like taking part in some kind of leisurely activity to relax and hanging out with your friends and enjoying a party or a meal, because that's what you kind of do when the sun is setting.
Right, exactly. And it's again, it relates back to that whole like at the end of a hard day's work, you go out with your friends and you hang out and you eat some beautiful food and have a couple of drinks, enjoy a party. So there's very much this kind of idea or this image of social intercourse, which is a strange phrase, but it kind of really does describe this kind of coming together of people and enjoying the pleasures of life, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some sort of like union aspect going on, which
Yeah.
we will literally go into marriage in just a second. So it kind of riffs off of that. And then there's also an interesting correlation between like the square relationship of the seventh and the 10th house, which oftentimes then it can also represent business partnerships or business relationships. Usually bound by some kind of legal, financial, or good faith contractual agreement.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's in Demetra George's Ancient Astrology, Volume 2. She talks about contractual relationships can also be something like a relationship between, say, like a therapist and a patient. So different kinds of relationships don't always have to be necessarily business per se, but oftentimes they are. It's essentially just somebody that you have some kind of contractual agreement with.
Yeah, I definitely think there's it just I think that's so much of like the relation between the seventh and the eighth house. And while we were both doing research, we also kind of realized there's a lot of like even in ancient texts, there is a bit of a quarrel between like what aspects to relate to the seventh house and what aspects to relate to the eighth house. It seems like both of these houses have kind of similar distinctions and they really like kind of fall into each other with the significations, especially also with the part of like oh, well, do we put death into the eighth house or the seventh house then? Because, like, symbolically, the end of the day would represent an ending as well. But then it also is totally visible in the eighth house. Or, again, this thing of like contractual relationships, which is so also eighth house of like, what do we owe other people or what do other people owe us? And like the
Right.
spouse's money being represented in the eighth, but then the
Yeah.
spouse being represented in the seventh. So, there's a interesting relationship between the seventh and the eighth for sure.
Totally. It's like about bonds and intimacy and yeah, just being like intertwined. And even in some cases enmeshed with other people.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about being in mesh with other people, the seventh house is literally also related to marriage and the idea of giving yourself over to something or someone else, which again kind of goes back to like the signification of plunging, sinking, entering or diving. And because also the symbolism of the seventh house where the sun sets, like the symbolism of the sun going into the earth, like forming this union, is also something that people correlated to the act of intercourse, like the sexual act, like a
Right.
visual representation. That's why that is also kind of related to the seventh house. And marriage was traditionally an arrangement, a union, and had a lot to do with consolidating property, finance, and status. So, an early underlying meaning of the seventh house relates to the consummation of the marriage through intercourse with the spouse.
Yeah, 100%. And also, like like just on the plunge, sink into a dive piece, like it made me immediately think of, taking the plunge. Like when you get married, you are literally like taking the plunge. It's this huge decision and commitment. It's very serious. You can't just like back out, So it's also takes like a huge leap of faith as well to be able to enter into this agreement and this contract with somebody else. And obviously, just as a little side to the marriage piece is also banquets and feasts relate to the celebration of marriage. So the seventh house was often associated with banquets and feasts as well, which would normally happen at a marriage, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I also think is interesting, I mean, we're talking about marriage now, but the seventh house really, besides marriage, has a lot to do with just like close one-on-one relationships, which don't necessarily have to be romantic relationships. We already
Right.
made an example previously, right? How it can also be a transit could also symbolize like a therapist or something like that. So it's just people you're more intimate with. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. It can be like also emotional intimacy or somebody that you trust, you open up with, which again could be a therapist. It could also just be a really, really close friend. And the seventh house really starts to be about other people and often coinciding more with what other people are doing and bringing into your life and not necessarily yourself. So, like, oftentimes transits in the seventh house can be much more symbolical of other people, not necessarily you yourself.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point to keep in mind, especially if you are tracking transits or keeping an eye on eclipses or something like that that's happening for you and your chart is to always remember that I mean we know that sort of one of the basic meanings of the seventh house is the other. So it's kind of the first thing that you would look to when you are considering the seventh house rather is that it most likely has something to do with other people and people in your environment around you.
Yeah, exactly. Like oftentimes if you have natal planets in your seventh house, they can be like descriptive of your partner. in a way. Like they don't necessarily have to be part of you. Like they can be descriptive of the people that you date. And I also at this point want to mention the whole empty houses thing, because if you have an empty seventh house, no, it does not mean you're cursed for life and you're not going to have any relationships or marry anyone. No. You have a ruler. So, depending on where the ruler of that seventh house is, this is going to give you much more significations. I mean, I think, yeah, Tiziana, you also don't have any planets in the seventh house in your natal chart, right?
No, I don't. And I actually wanted
Exactly.
to mention like the other transit story just on the whole empty house thing. So, like, even if you do have an empty house, you can still have like a seventh house transit that can do so. I mean, look, I have planets in the first, so that has a lot to do with it as well. But
Hmm.
I had a subjectively bad seventh house Saturn transit. And of course, many years later, and in retrospect, it was a good thing. That was Saturn. I was talking about the eclipses earlier that happened in across my first and seventh houses, and these two particularly in my seventh house. And then shortly after that, Saturn had been just entered my seventh house, and had been hanging around in my seventh house. So I was having eclipses in the seventh house. I was having Saturn transiting my seventh house. Both of those were triggering seventh house topics. But um, Also, as Amiya said, you can look, if you have no planets in the seventh house, you can look to the ruler. So, my example is I have Mercury ruling my seventh house, and Mercury is placed in my 11th house. And I was actually having a think about it, and I realized actually my partner is, in fact, a benefactor and ally in many ways, and has actually connected me socially to other people. So, that's a really interesting way to get information about your seventh house. If you don't have any planets in the seventh house, you just look to the ruler and you see where it's placed, and you see the condition of that planet, and then you can get a lot of information from that.
Yeah, absolutely. My seventh house is also empty. I have Taurus, so Venus ruling my seventh house, and my natal Venus is in Capricorn. And for example, right, because people are like, oh, like I don't date anyone of the like on my decent, because everyone's like, oh, look at your descendant to see what types of people you date with, and I don't really have a lot any people with like significant Taurus placements in my life, so I was wondering
Yeah.
that a few years ago as well. But then if I look back, there's like every single person that I had close relationship with has at least one, if not more, Capricorn planets, and it's so prominent. Like everyone I meet with like more intimately, they always have some sort of Capricorn things going on. So I think that's very
Yeah.
telling. And also like the significations of the third house. I'm just thinking that um like my very first like official boyfriend that I had, the way that I met him was like he was the brother of a friend of mine. So which is like, the sibling association with the third house. So like I met him through him being like a sibling to a friend of mine. So I thought that
Right.
quite interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, and like what it's also making me think of is like if you have, for example, you were saying like, well, I have Mercury in Capricorn, for example, and it's Capricorn's ruled by Saturn. And so the sign that or the ruler of the sign that your seventh house, where your seventh house is, can give you a lot of information also about the quality of the relationships that you have, and also like maybe like some kind of preference. So I think it's interesting for me, and this is anyway for my chart that I've gleaned for myself. I don't know about other people, but Mercury's in Capricorn, and I tend to want to. I'm normally attracted to people that are a little bit more mature than me, or older than me, and also like I take my relationships like really seriously. So I think that that's an interesting sort of way to look at the seventh house ruler as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely look at how it's aspected, because this will also give you more information. And then again, you can do this with literally any planets, but if then your ruler, so if in my case, we use Venus and Capricorn, and I mean, I actually just had like my Venus return today, so
Oh,
super
happy
prominent.
Venus
Woo! But then like
return.
that is activating my seventh house, like so.
Exactly. So the other interesting thing about the seventh house is that it is associated with desires and enjoyments. So there's these there's these Hindu concepts called purusharthas, which basically represent the four proper goals or objectives or the pillars of life, if you can say, which are associated with different principles. And the seventh house is associated with the principle of karma, which, as I said, is desire, it's pleasure, and it's an enjoyment. And so this obviously then makes you think about how it coincides with marriage and banquets and what we spoke about, the social intercourse thing earlier on. And I just found this really great article by an astrologer named P. James Clark from classicalastrologer.com. And I just wanted to read this piece,
Hmm.
which relates to the seventh house and the definition of karma. So he says, best understood as aesthetics, the definition of karma involves sensual gratification, sexual fulfillment, the pleasure of the senses, love, and the ordinary enjoyments of life, regarded as one of the four ends of man. This would naturally be closely related to the associations we have of Venus in traditional Western astrology. Karma means desire, wish, longing, but it would be a great mistake to think of this as trivial. In Hinduism, it is understood that without desire, there would be nothing at all. In the time before time and creation, Vishnu dreams the universe reclining on the coils of the serpent Shesha, accompanied by his consort Lakshmi, and he dreams the universe into reality. It is Lakshmi who stimulates the universal dream by her touch. So, in fact, the universe was born of desire. This will seem somewhat alien to the Western astrologer, but that is because we tend to want to separate pleasure from wisdom. The pleasures of karma, the seventh house, include the pleasures of the higher mind. If our pleasures lead us astray, then Dharma is there to reset the balance. And I just love that because it also, I suppose you could also then talk about the, as you've said, the sextile relationship to the fifth and the ninth, which brings to mind also shared belief systems. But it's interesting that it's intertwined with pleasure, is what I'm hearing him say. Like there's pleasures of the higher mind, but there's also like physical pleasure. And yeah, so I love that quote.
Absolutely. It goes back to the feasting, devouring.
Yeah.
Totally, the banquet. Yeah. I really like that. And I think with this, we can also kind of go to the segment where we talk about the relationship of the houses. I mean, the relationship of the seventh house to the other houses. We already touched upon the angular triad where we relate the seventh house to the sixth and the eighth. But yeah, let's talk about the trines. So the seventh house in relation to the third and the 11th. Because for me, I like to call this the triad of our social life and bonds, because it all has to do with who we are surrounding ourselves with and the people we have into our lives and how these connections are so influential.
Yeah, totally. Definitely agree with that. And also, like, one other thing that kind of comes to mind with we'll get into the polarity of the first and seventh houses soon, but one other sort of topic or theme or signification, if you can say, of the seventh house is open enemies. And that is because of this aspectual opposition between the first and the seventh. So one of the significations of the seventh house can also be open enemies. There's this adversarial opposition to the ascendant. So um, I always thought that that was quite fascinating because while the seventh house does represent our relationships, it can also represent our enemies.
Yeah, 100%. And then it's just like, yeah, more obvious types of
Yeah.
enemies. Like
Yeah.
it's like not what we think immediately, but there's many people that have these relationships and they kind of openly dislike each other, and yet they still end up like staying together. So I can totally see how it is a house of open enemies.
100%. Yeah. It's not like the 12th house where you have like hidden enemies and you
Hmm.
don't really know if someone's like your enemy, but yeah, the seventh house can definitely show some open enemy stuff.
Yeah, it feels like like the mean girls from school. They're like downright like bash each other.
Yeah.
But then they like stay friends for some sort of status or whatever, which also kind of feels like I mean, because I think people tend to forget that marriage was not a symbol of love per se for the longest
Right.
time. It was really to like for status and for merging
Yeah.
belongings and everything. So the forefront wasn't necessarily like love and like wanting to spend the rest of their life with that person. 'Cause some people have a lot of luck in arranged marriages and they tend to make it work out after, spending time with that person, but it's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah. Or like your wife or husband can actually be your literal enemy. It like makes me think of King Henry VIII. Like he had so many wives and it just seemed like he was at constant war with his wives and he always saw his wife as an enemy. He had a few of his wives um, like decapitated and,
Yeah.
sent to death. And his last wife also constantly living in fear of being put to death or something because she was trying to, do her own thing and her husband was sort of ruling everything. And so it's this weird kind of enmeshment thing that we were talking about earlier, where you are married and it's this contract, but as you say, marriage was originally something that was about social status and finance, not necessarily at all about love. And so you could actually be at war and have your husband or wife as an enemy, which is really weird and interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, let's talk also a bit about like the squares. So the squares would be the fourth and the 10th house from the seventh house. And again, it's the angles. I feel like the angles are super straightforward for the most part
Yeah,
with what they symbolize. So, the fourth house is kind of your like ancestry and your family, which can be in conflict with the person you end up marrying. Kind of again, we can touch upon like arranged marriages, like because it's like you can
exactly.
either have luck or not with depending on who your family kind of
Or
chooses
you're
for
like,
you.
or like you
Exactly.
really don't like your in-laws, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
so that's the tension. And then the 10th house is obviously again work, kind of getting in the way of things or what you want to pursue. Yeah.
yeah, and also I think you mentioned earlier when we were prepping, like also the have like the ruler, for example, the ruler of the seventh being in the 10th, it could mean something like you meet your partner in a work environment or like in your career, for example.
Yeah, and then let's touch upon the sextiles. We already did briefly, which is that would be the fifth and the ninth house in relation to the seventh house, which the sextiles are more of a pleasurable aspect. Their sextiles are ruled by Venus. So I think with the fifth house, we can think of what usually comes of a union with two people, or traditionally comes from the union of two people, is children. So a child is born, which is kind of represented by the fifth house. But also, you would like if there is no child involved, because that is totally also fine. Um, it's like, what do you do? Like ideally, you don't want to merge your whole life and do everything with your partner, but you definitely want to have some things in common that you can both do as a leisurely activity, which is kind of like the fifth house. And then the ninth house, which you touched a bit on before, is like, oh, the beliefs, which is like such a core of a relationship and can kind of be a very big make or break in a relationship. It's like, oh, do we have the same foundation of what we believe in, what we want to do in life that holds this partnership together?
Absolutely, that's super important. Yeah, and I mean, I suppose from here we can probably jump into the topic of the polarity of the first and the seventh houses.
Hmm.
So as we said earlier, there is a aspectual line from the first house to the seventh, which is essentially an opposition. So, what does this opposition tell us? I mean, it basically sets up the self other polarity, and it's this Saturnian opposition, which we alluded to earlier. It also sets up this light dark polarity and this diurnal nocturnal, which we spoke about with regards to the rising and the setting of the sun. So, again, the rising of the sun, normally associated with birth, beginnings, and renewal, and then the setting of the sun associated with endings and death. So, because the seventh house opposes the ascendant, it kind of brings up this question of who are we in relationship to others? Because the seventh house is like you've said, it's like a mirror. So, your partner or the relationships that you have are holding up a mirror, and that essentially forces us to examine our own identities, our personalities, and how we show up in the relationship, which is a lot of that, the like identity part and the personality part and the character of who we are is first house. So then it really is a beautiful sort of description of that polarity between self and other, I think. And then, of course, what you've said earlier about the ascendant and descendant degrees, those are quite important and sensitive points in the seventh house, the descendant degree. So, of course, if you have any transits or eclipses, for example, that are hitting that descendant degree, those are super, super important to pay attention to.
Yeah, it can just be major beginnings, major endings, which is
Right.
what we often hear with eclipses in and of itself. But when they are hitting close to your ascendant, descendant line, but even other planets, it can just
Right.
be like, yeah, like a major beginning or ending point of something.
Yeah. And I think also just like going off of that, it makes me think of if you have, for example, like a slower moving planet like Saturn or Jupiter, that's going over that degree like a couple of times for like a long period of time, that can often be a really significant time in your life that is kind of like extra important to, like there's a lot of stuff you need to like work through when you're having a transit from like a slower moving planet to maybe the descendant degree, more so than say, like a Venus or maybe a Mars. If Mars is retrograding, that could also be important.
Mhm.
But generally, I would say, yeah, like, you know, slower moving planets, and even the artists can often, on that point, would definitely like trigger some seventh house significations for sure.
I mean, one example that I can kind of bring from my life, because this is kind of happening right now, is that, Uranus is basically opposite my sun and ascendant. So, it already went across it earlier this year, and now it's retrograding back. It's very close again now. I think less than 1 degree apart from my sun and ascendant. And what I have kind of found is that there's a big instinct inside of me of just craving freedom, just like other people kind of feeling very suffocating. Or I don't know if that's the best way I can describe it, but just that's kind of the feeling that I'm getting. So it feels kind of scary to attach myself to anyone or anything because it just feels like so disruptive. And I feel like that's definitely like Uranus, like sitting on the descendant degree doing its thing.
Yeah, that's like a real life example. This sense of needing freedom and, in the realm of relationships, like not wanting to necessarily be tied down to any one thing or any one relationship and just needing that space to kind of individuate, and do your own thing.
Yeah, which is hard because like I'm more of a long-term person, but like Uranus in the seventh house has really been doing the opposite essentially. So yeah.
Yeah, and so we were talking about the polarity of the first and the seventh house, talking about it being the first house is self and the seventh
Mhm.
house is other. And there's a great Jungian psychologist, James Hollis, and he wrote this incredible book called The Eden Project in Search of the Magical Other. And there's just a couple of quotes that I wanted to read through to kind of just as points of discussion, which really allude to the relationship between the first and the seventh houses. So here goes. All relationships begin and end in separation, he says. Through the blood web of our mothers, we start out connected to the pulse and rhythm of the cosmos. And then we are torn from the mother, the archetypal mother he's talking about here, and separated from the cosmos, separated from the gods, separated forever. And we close all relationships of our lives through that separation we call death. And I just thought that was so beautiful in describing, first of all, this relationship that we have with ourselves as well as with the other, and the fact that it ends in separation. You know, the
Mhm.
Saturnian quality of the opposition talks about separation, but it also talks about togetherness. And
Mhm.
ultimately, at the end of the day, we will end our relationships through separation. And sometimes that separation obviously involves death. So it's quite heavy, but it really does describe so beautifully that the seventh house being associated with endings and sometimes literal or figurative or metaphorical death of a relationship, for example. And then he goes on to say, if there is a single idea which permeates this essay, it is that the quality of all of our relationships is a direct function of the relationship we have with ourselves. The best thing we can do for our relationships with others and with the transcendent is to render our relationships to ourselves more conscious. And I know there's something that you wanted to add here about Esther Perel, I think, when we discussed prior.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I wanted to I had a quote that she said that really stuck with me a few years ago when I was watching a lot of her videos and content. And she said the quality of our relationship determines the quality of our life. And I think that's like such an impactful statement because it just kind of brings forth the fact that relationships are so central. I mean, you need something or someone else to relate to know that you even really exist because how does consciousness know it exists otherwise, like on a pure like level like that? Like it has to have a mirror, it has to have something that shows itself back, reflects itself back to be like, oh, I am conscious. There is another thing reflecting this back to me. So I think that's such an interesting point because I think it also goes back to the notion of I mean, it's just like a general quote. I don't know who said that, but just the thing of where like somebody says, "Oh, show me the five closest people to you, and I'll show you your future." So the way we choose our friends and the people we spend our time with is like so impactful, like really to the
right,
point where it kind of determines where we head and go into life. So it's not
right.
something to necessarily be taken so lightly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like something along the lines of you are the sum total of
Yeah.
the five people you spend the most time with, or something like that. Yeah, 100%. I love that. Yeah, and I also like just kind of going on with his reference also to the transcendent, which is what also the seventh house is associated with, where when we spoke about the worship of the gods. So he goes on to say, this is not a narcissistic activity. In fact, it will prove to be the most loving thing we can do for the other. The greatest gift to others is our own best selves. Thus, paradoxically, if we are to serve relationships well, we are obliged to affirm our individual journey. It is no accident that the primary motive, the hidden agenda in any relationship is the yearning to return. I love that. It is essentially a religious search, he says, attested to by the etymology of the word religion from Latin religare, I think it is, to tie back to reconnect with. So this really speaks to, again, this yearning that every human being has to be in relationship with, as well as in relationship with something that transcends us. And for most people, that is God, that is source, that is a higher power, however you want to put it, whatever, regardless of your religion or religious belief. You know, everyone has this yearning and this natural desire to want to reconnect with our source. And we do that for the most part through our relationships. as well.
Yeah, 100%. It's so, I mean, even as astrologers, I could say that or argue that like we have a relationship to the cosmos and to the stars on a pretty
Totally.
much daily basis. That's kind of what forms the base of how we interact with because I can't just like take my astrological lenses off. That's just how I view the world. Like if I
Yeah.
want to or not, I'm just like consciously aware of what's going on and then I see the planets show up and I'm like, this is where Venus Mars showed up today. Oh, this is what was going on in the real world. And I think it kind of goes back to the very like I mean, which is also kind of the core question of astrology. Does this thing above have something to do with what is happening down below?
Right.
And like
Right.
the center of like hermeticism, I think, which is like as within, so without, as above, so below. So that's
Yeah.
kind of also the basis of the first seventh house.
Yeah, I love that. That's a really good point. And this is probably a good time to kind of jump into the topic of psychological projection. So
Hmm.
obviously, Hellenistic is for the most part more about concrete topics and stuff that can happen that isn't necessarily something to do with the individual, but it can be the individual as well as can be people around you and people in your life. But I do think it's really important to touch on the topic of psychological projection, especially because the first house, which is opposite the seventh house, relates to our psychology as well as our
Hmm.
identity, as well as our character, etc. So, I mean, yeah, if we just go into what projection is, I mean, it's a normal thing. It's nothing weird or bad or anything. It's normal and everybody does it. And oftentimes we're doing it most of the time we're doing it unconsciously. And it's essentially when an individual unconsciously projects their thoughts, their feelings, or behaviors onto somebody else. And it's not always, we can project subjectively good and bad qualities onto other people. So, as an example, I can say, like, oh, my friend is so intelligent and I'm not. So, that's like a good quality that I'm projecting onto somebody else. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not intelligent. I'm just seeing it in the other person and projecting it onto them and kind of putting them on a pedestal, so to speak. Or it can be something like, oh, my brother is so lazy and I'm not. Or my coworker is so obnoxious. And we're not actually not everything is necessarily projection, but it is good to be aware and to like ask yourself, like when you're perceiving somebody else, could I be projecting my
Hmm.
own laziness or my own, um, being obnoxious onto somebody else, or is this person in fact obnoxious? And it can often be a combination of the two, but it is good. It's a good way to kind of like check yourself, to make sure that because that again also determines, like you were saying earlier, and we were talking about earlier, that determines the quality of your relationship. So if you like constantly projecting good stuff onto another person, you're actually taking away from who you are. And you're putting this
Hmm.
other person on this like pedestal as if they're so amazing, they're so intelligent, they're so beautiful, and like you're not. And then conversely, you can do the same thing with negative qualities or thoughts or behaviors. And this is often what happens in intimate relationships. And usually, like the first few years or like the honeymoon period of a relationship, you don't see any of that. It's only like much later on where you really start seeing things in yourself and in your partner that you might not necessarily like. And a lot of this happens through the process of projection. And again, it's normal. There's nothing wrong or bad about it, but it is a good thing to be aware of because it helps us to kind of come back to ourselves and to like own who we are so that we can be like more whole and more individual and more functional in our relationships at the end of the day. So yeah, it's a psychological defense mechanism. And Carl Jung said something great. He said, I would rather be whole than good. And, he understood that we need to acknowledge our unconscious shadow thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And again, that can be good or bad. Like we can be, unconscious of our own good qualities. And for years and years and years, you can be projecting your own intelligence, your own positive qualities onto other people. And that is something when you start owning your projections and understanding your own projections, that you can take that back and you can go, hang on, actually I am, you know, better than I thought I was, or I actually do have these qualities that I've been seeing in somebody else all this time and actually doing myself a disservice.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as you said, it's like it's so prominent, especially in this intimate relationship, because these are usually the relationship that kind of like trigger us the most. And I mean, trigger is such an overused word nowadays.
It is,
But it's
but
like
it's true. It's true.
yeah, it's because like it is true to the degree where like if something really trigger, or you could say, oh, something really like does something in yourself,
Yeah,
like it
like
upsets
absolutely.
you or it brings up emotions. Like that's usually something that you would have to look at and examine of like why is it bothering you so much? Like if somebody, because like for example, if we put the setting at work or whatever, and a coworker is really bothering you with their behavior, but the other people seem to be fine with it, then it's like, okay, why is it bothering you specifically so much to the
Right.
point where I don't know, you can't contain yourself anymore? So like that's like, okay, let's examine what the projections are inside
Yeah,
yourself.
that's such a great example because actually the work environment is probably in some ways as intimate as, and when I say intimacy, obviously I'm not referring to sexual intimacy. I'm talking to like,
Mm.
being really close, working really closely with someone. You see your work colleagues, for example, for more time during the day than you actually
Mhm.
spend with your partner. So you are like it is a form of intimacy, and those are the situations where you're gonna quote unquote be tested, and you're gonna come across you might have conflict with a colleague, etc. And
Um, I feel like a realization I have every few months on a deeper level or a different level is always like, oh yeah, the outer world really is a reflection of my internal world. Like by the
yeah,
littlest things. And it's so crazy because it's like so true, but every time I realize it in this new and different ways, and it's so interesting because I'm a person that I changed a lot. I mean, I know everybody changed a lot through their years, but I would say I changed a bit extra, a lot more than a few people. And I can totally see how every time I don't know, I had a new style, new interests, and like other people that I surrounded myself with, it was such a reflection of whatever I was going through at that moment. And then when
yeah,
I entered into a new phase, everything changed. So it's so real. And sometimes even very annoying to be completely honest when you realize
yeah,
that, because then you're like, oh gosh, these people around me also somehow represent something within me. And like if they're annoying, that means that like I'm annoyed at something within myself. And
100%.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And again, work is a perfect example because I think so many people have these quarrels and everything at work. And I know a few years back when I was working at a shop, I was like doing this little thought experiment with myself where I was kind of like, okay, what does every single other person that works here, like what did they represent within me? Like what part of myself do they kind of represent in the outer world? And it was like just such a fun experiment in a way to do this because I could find tidbits of myself in like every person. And yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely also a reflection because it's like depends on what type of job you're doing is also a reflection of your internal self, your values, or like what work environments you put yourself through and what you accept. Like, do you accept a low paying job? Like that also is some sort of internal reflection of you and what you
yeah,
do.
yeah, 100%. Like your self-worth and all of these things. So it is, and it's like you're saying, it is kind of like a difficult pill to swallow, I suppose, because it kind of makes you responsible for
Yeah.
everything. So you can't like just turn around and be like, well, it's their fault. And it's like, no, in relationship, it's two people are involved and, it takes two to tango, as they would say. And so you have to, this is what's so great about understanding your own projections is it kind of, helps you to own what is yours and to separate out what is yours
Mhm.
from what is the other person's. And a lot of that it often involves like historical psychological baggage or emotional baggage or like trauma and things like that you can like bring in from your past into a relationship that'll have like a direct impact on the quality of that relationship. So if you can learn to like identify your triggers, I'm going to use that word because it is the word, like to understand why you get triggered or what triggers you is a great step um in understanding your own projections and like getting to know yourself more. And then once you get to know yourself more, you can operate more effectively in a relationship. You can also heal the split between, these shadow parts of yourself that you've maybe rejected within yourself or, suppressed in yourself. And so yeah, that's the sort of essence of what projection really is. And like you were saying, we can't really know ourselves in a vacuum. We do need this container of relationship. It's the natural way of things, and there's no way getting around it. We learn about who we are in relation to other, and we can only really gain self-knowledge, I believe, in my humble opinion, through self-examination. If you're not able to self-reflect and like look at yourself when you get feedback from your relationships or from your environment, then, I think that's a problematic thing. We need to be able to look at ourselves and question how we show up.
Yeah, I also you put this quote in here from the Tao Te Ching, which is he who knows others is clever, he who knows himself has discernment, he who overcomes others has force, he who overcomes himself is strong. And yeah, I really like that part because it kind of goes back to literally what you were just saying, which is yeah, like knowing yourself is such a superpower because once you
Yeah.
know yourself, you can like assert yourself, you can actually set boundaries, you can like if you kind of know what you like and dislike, you can begin to actually live. And I think that's also what a lot of people get wrong because then and I'm just saying that because like I went through that. I'm not above that. But like when I realized like when I had a separation, it was pretty rough on me. And then I kind of just realized like, ooh, I was not really good at setting boundaries and like I let people run all over me. And then I kind of just like isolated myself from all sorts of relationships because, well, everything became triggering. But that's because I was just afraid that I would not be able to set boundaries again in the future
Right.
as well. But then how can I know if I am isolating myself? Like I kind of have to go into relationship again. We kind of have to like put ourselves out there and accept the feedback, even if it's yeah, even if it's but then we know more. Like that's the thing. Like even if it's
Right.
harsh and even if like the worst thing happened and I really like I can vouch for myself, I definitely had like a hard time. Sometimes I still do when I go out because I feel like, oh, I'm not gonna be able to handle it. Like I'm gonna get triggered, like it's worst case gonna trigger some sort of panic attack or something. And I don't want to go through that. But
Right.
but the only way to overcome this is if I go out and see like, oh, well, am I strong enough
Right.
to stand up for myself when it's too much? What will I do in this situation?
I mean, like what it also brings up for me is this idea that at the end of the day, the only thing we can really control is ourselves.
Yeah.
That's really, really powerful. So, like, what's really interesting about this idea of projection is, and this is kind of heading towards the end of our talk, but I thought it was nice to just bring in the idea of projection, not just happening in our one-on-one relationships, but also in groups, So what can often happen is individuals and groups can like externalize the quote unquote enemy, which is also again the seventh house, open enemies, that kind of thing. So individuals project their own unconscious and like rejected parts within themselves onto groups or politicians or even religious institutions, your parents, your friends, your coworkers, and like so on. And obviously, I'm not saying like all the problems we see out there are like strictly as a result of projection. It's more about understanding the connection between like how we show up in relationship first with ourselves and then with the other, so yeah, this extends to families, it extends to groups, it extends to organizations as well. And like you can kind of like I don't want to get into any kind of political discussion or anything, but you can obviously see this happening and what has been happening with, this certain things that are playing out in the world on the world stage, which have been, very difficult and very controversial and emotionally charged. So it's when there's a lot of division and polarization, which is also something that is sort of exacerbated by social media, unfortunately, then there's that split that's happening,
Mhm.
and people kind of tend to take their own stuff and project it outward onto people or groups or organizations. So those groups or those organizations or that political party or so on become the quote unquote enemy. So, it's interesting like to look at it like that and to see how it plays out in the collective. And also to notice like how we can get caught up in that quite easily and in the sort of ideologies of groups and of different, religions, for example. And again, this is not saying that any particular group or any particular religion or institution is wrong or bad or the enemy necessarily. It's just really about recognizing that we do that, whether we sometimes, I mean, I would hope that some people are conscious of the fact that they are doing that, but a lot of the time it's happening unconsciously. And so it's interesting to see that projection can happen like between in a relationship between two people on a like one-on-one situation, but also from, an individual onto the collective.
Yeah, and Carl Jung had a very strong conviction about how the world can only really transform if we begin with looking at our individual darkness first. And darkness isn't always subjectively bad, it's that which is hidden, suppressed, or denied an expression. And yeah, it's going back to what you were saying, where like it's kind of like, be the change you wish to see type of thing, where it's like
Yeah,
start with yourself, like take the responsibility first instead of just because that's I think when the projection mostly comes from, where when we feel powerless and like we can't be this thing or take upon this challenge, then we start to
yeah,
project things onto other people when it's really about like starting within ourselves first. Obviously, like there's definitely like groups and organizations are also responsible for things, but we are also still responsible for ourselves and doing things. So it's more like the fingers should be pointed at everyone, like not just ourselves, but it starts
yeah,
what we can take responsibility for and what we can take control of. And that is like mostly it's just ourselves that we can really control to
yeah.
some degree.
100%, and it makes me think of that like Christian quote from the Bible, which comes to mind is um, look at the log in your eye first before you point out the speck in your brother's eye. I think it's something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing, but it's really about, like you saying, first look at yourself and where you can, you know, be better and improve or just, you know, own what is yours and then you can start like pointing fingers at others. And it's a really, really, really hard thing to do. It's easier for people to judge than to actually sit and think like about a situation, and a lot of the sort of charge that these discussions in the collective have are because people are being triggered on, in ways that they're probably not even really aware of. And so there's like so much of this like hatred and vitriol and like finger pointing and stuff like flying around. And that's it's always like looking for the something or someone else to blame. But yeah, just sort of repeating what you said is coming back to yourself, owning your projections, and getting to know yourself and working on yourself. And then, then you can start like becoming more involved in the collective and doing the things whether you're an activist or whatever. So those things are all important. It's definitely it's a good thing to be involved in causes and to fight for things that are important to you, but I'm not in such a way that, you're coming at it as if you're completely like innocent and you have no part to play in how things are, happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like it's a good way to conclude the seventh house talk because it's it's like a heavier house, you could say in a way, but it's also true because it's an angle, so it is so prominent and important. And oh, I find the seventh house, and I said that to you before we started to like do our whole document and everything, and I was like, oh, the seventh house kind of bores me because it feels so. It's like I think most of the questions like I see like usually when I'm on Reddit currently and everything is always about relationships, 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 and it's fine. Like people are allowed to have these questions. Again, it's like the core again our relationships make our life worth living. So I totally get it. But in a way, I just always feel like, oh, it's like, I don't want to talk about the seventh house. It's like, I always look at the seventh house. But I think we did a really good job at kind of also explaining the bit, like, I don't, maybe you could say maybe darker themes or like the more serious themes of that house, which are also so
Yeah.
important for people to listen and to hear to. So I'm really happy with yeah, what we were bringing up with the seventh house.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think like on the surface, it can be like, oh, it's just the seventh house and it's just about relationships. But when you really start digging into it, it's actually quite a deep house. It has a lot of, really interesting topics and things that kind of get you thinking quite deeply. So
Yeah, okay, cool. Then I think we can conclude our seventh house talk with this. And I just want to thank everyone for sticking around until the end. If you have, I really appreciate, if you took the time and energy to listen. And yeah, we both hope you learned something new. And please feel free to, type in the comments about your experiences with the seventh house. If you have any planets in the seventh house, any transits or transit stories from the seventh house. I think we would both really appreciate reading them. So, yeah, Tiziana, do you want to shout out your socials and what you're up to?
yeah, I mean, thanks so much. This was super fun. Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me on again. Thank you. And yeah, just if anyone would like to connect with me, you could please give me a follow on Instagram. My handle is Liminal Warrior. I also make bi-monthly new and full moon posts there to talk about the current energies. And every now and then I'll throw in some stuff about depth psychology if you're interested. I'm also active on threads where I love talking all things astrology, and I'm also open for readings. Please email me at astrology@liminalspaces.co.za for more details if you feel called to do so.
Yeah, I link everything down below in the description so you can find both of us. And if you want to stay in touch, with me, I mean, even just if you want to continue following the podcast, because there's still a lot of houses to go through. We're at the halfway mark now officially. So, yeah, the Resonance Astrology podcast is available on Spotify and on YouTube under the same name. And if you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and share it if you found it useful. And yeah, if you want to stay in touch with me and follow and contact me, you can do so under on Instagram under resonance.astrology or on my website resonanceastrology.com. And yeah, since the last episode, I'm actually also shouting out my Reddit account because I'm kind of active on there, which is completely different, but it's Haruka. So I'm totally also gonna link that below if you want to, follow me on there. Or if you're listening from there, totally appreciate all the Reddit people. And Yeah, my email is resonanceastrology@gmail.com. And so if you're interested in bookings, please reach out over that email. But you can also shoot me a DM on Instagram and I will answer there. So yeah, please stay tuned for the other parts. And I wish you a lovely and pleasant day or evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.